Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you at the end of January 2021, and we're still doing this online, but good news for us. Next Sunday, we'll be back in person again. Looking forward to that. We're going back to still our safety measures with social distancing and masks, but we're going to have coffee and donuts. We're going to have regular communion elements like the big hunks of bread and big things of juice with safety protocols instituted. So looking forward to seeing how that goes. And we'll also be simulcasting at the same time. So for those of you that still don't feel comfortable yet coming, you'll still be able to watch as well. I want to tell you a story before we dive into the text today. The year was 2007. And I was playing a pickup basketball game on 28th Street in Kalamazoo at that park across from Meyer. And we would go there every Saturday and play with a bunch of guys. And there were a lot of good players. And of course, I've told you a little bit about my basketball prowess in the past, if you've been with me long enough. Most of these guys, if not all of them, have played organized basketball at some point, usually high school. And some of them definitely were stars in college. And so these are some really good basketball players. Now, I was pretty good myself when I was younger. I was a really great shooter. 6'4", I had tremendous advantages over a lot of other people. Not only could I shoot the three, I could post up inside, and I was really quick. I had a great first step. I was very explosive. I could jump over 3 feet off the ground. In fact, I remember, taking one step, jumping off both feet, and putting both my elbows on the rim in my 10th grade year. So I definitely have some hops and definitely very athletic. Now, if you've ever played anything like that as you get older, I was playing these basketball games. I know I'm good. I get there and I go to jump to get a rebound, and I can't even get as high as the rim anymore. Or I go to shoot a three and I'm short, and it feels like I'm shooting a half-court shot. Any of you know what I'm talking about? It doesn't matter what sport it is or anything. You weren't as good as you used to be. And what's weird is that my body doesn't know that. Like, I try to jump and I think I can jump 3 feet off the ground, and it doesn't happen. And now I might be lucky if I jump 3 inches off the ground it's really hard, to know that. And I just remember, after the game, and I played horrible. And I was talking to the guys, what I said? He's like, I know I'm a lot better than this. I know I can do so much. I was so good when I was younger, and I know I'm much better than this. And I know I could shoot the three. And if I just, keep practicing a little more, I'll get better. And there's so many times even where I said, man, I wish I could dunk a basketball again. I can't even come close to doing that anymore. More or less touch the rim at this point. I couldn't shoot as well as I did when I was younger. Can't do any of that stuff. And now, when I step on the basketball court now, it's like I am just a big lump of mass that takes up space and just pushes people around. That's all I'm good for. I can wear people down physically, but any other talent in me, I'm not that great. And I'm also not in shape, so it just doesn't help. So I don't know if any of you have been in that situation or remember that. You just like, man, I wish I had those skills again, or I wish I could do this like I used to. That is a great segue to what we're going to read this morning as we continue our series in our Ecclesiastes series, Meaningless, as it's said many times in the scripture, Havel. And I put it with the question mark because it's really a book of wisdom literature. It's about meaning, the meaning of life, and wisdom in that. And so, in fact, we're going to dive into that today with wisdom as we look at Ecclesiastes chapter 7. We're going to move forward in the book a little bit. I know we were in chapters 3 and 4 last week, but we're going to skip forward to 7. We can't cover every chapter in this book. I wish we could, but we're going to go to chapter 7 today. So if you have your Bibles, open to Ecclesiastes. It's in the Hebrew Bible right after Proverbs, and we'll look at chapter 7 starting in verse 1. I'll be reading from the ESV this morning. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity. Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from the wisdom that you ask this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. And consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful, and in the day of adversity consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. God, I ask this morning that my words would be your words. God, that you would soften our hearts to hear the word that you have for us, that we would be listening, that we would let go of all of the things that have happened this week to focus on what your Holy Spirit has to say to us in this moment. In the name of Jesus, and everybody said, amen. So as we ventured through this book, and regrettably we can't go through all of the book this series, we've seen that the teacher has told us over and over again, and you've probably got this picture, that you can't control everything. As much as you want to try, as much as I want to try, you can't control everything. And not only that, we recognize that there is so much brokenness in our world. It's kind of like Captain Obvious, right? There is so much brokenness, but maybe in the moment right now, it just feels like it's so overwhelming, all this brokenness. And so in this chapter, at the beginning of this chapter, there's a couple of threads that the teacher wants to pull a little bit and go back and forth with. One of those ways is what we might call escapism, is one thread that he pulls. Basically, once we come to grips that we can't control everything, once we come to grips that there's so much brokenness in the world, then the question is, how are we going to respond to that? How are we going to live our lives in light of that? One of them is escapism, where we just can't deal with all of it. We flee what's real right in front of us and try to escape all the problems of life in all sorts of ways. And we'll dive into this later on in the chapter as we go further through the teaching. Escapism. The other option the teacher highlights is wisdom, which we've talked about this being a wisdom book. To learn to live in God's world despite all the brokenness we see and experience. What's interesting is that by we get to the end of the text that we read today, the teacher seems to suggest that pursuing wisdom is obviously a good thing, but it's not going to tell you everything about what you want to know. So it seems like a Debbie Downer again in some ways, but hang on, we'll get through it with the teaching. I think you'll find it challenging and encouraging. So he suggests that there's somewhere in the middle of all this, in this wisdom, between the running away from the brokenness, the escapism, and then pursuing wisdom. We either try to hide it or hide from it, or we think if we can attain all the wisdom we can and know it all and everything, we can function and know everything there is to know about life. And apparently today we're going to find out there are limitations to wisdom. And so let's go to verse 1. He starts there with this invitation. And it's one we've come across before, but now he's going to get really in depth with it as he decides to dive in a little more. He says this in verse 1. A good name is better than ointment, the day of death than the day of birth. I mean, if you think about it, that sounds a little morbid, doesn't it? Like you're a little obsessed with death, dude. I mean, you've been talking about this whole book, and you're like, the day of death is better than the day of birth? Why would he say that? That sounds morbid. That sounds horrible. And he keeps that tone for like the next 5 verses in chapter 7. Why in the world would death ever be better than birth? What in the world is the teacher talking about here? Well, if you take a step back and you think about it, and he's, he obviously thinks about things very differently, and he's a wise person himself, the author and the teacher, the character. When you think about birth, birth is all about potential, which is a good thing, right? That's a very good thing. When someone is born, if you think about, what can you really say about a person who was just born, a baby that was just born? I mean, really the only thing that you say, other than, oh, small and cute, right? Is, oh, look at his eyes, or look at her mouth, or look, right? You say, looks like her mom or his grandfather, right? We say about the resemblance of what that baby may look like. And that's about all you can say, right? Other than, oh, it's so cute and congratulations, right? Now, flip the coin. What about death? What can you say about the day of death? Let's say this baby lives on to be like 86 years old, okay? And you're at the funeral for the 86-year-old. What do you say about them then? I mean, you could say, she was so kind and generous. She really loved Jesus. She lived her life like Jesus. Or she loved children. Or she really loved going out in the garden or going outside. Or, she really loved Michigan and teasing Mike about the Ohio State Buckeyes all the time. Whatever, right? Or you could say, like, she's really aggressive at bingo. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you can say at the day of death. And so what the teacher is ultimately saying through these first 6 verses as he goes through is death is a better teacher about life than birth. Remember, he's talking about wisdom. That's what this chapter is going to talk about. What is about wisdom and living the best kind of life? He says that death is a better teacher than birth. Of course, birth is exciting. And I'm sure he would probably argue that death is way less better than life, or, birth, right? I mean, it's true. I think about those many times that I've done funerals, I've officiated funerals, and I think about what sacred moments there is sitting with families and talking through what they remember about the person who passed away. It's an incredible moment to go back and think about, really the question, right? I mean, I think this is what I would ask, in light of this is, when my time has come, when my day has finally come to die, did I live my life like it was worth something? Was my life important? Did it matter? What was my purpose, and did I live that out, right? Do you ask those questions? That's what the teacher is driving the point toward when you think about the day of your death. The day of your death necessitates that you actually think about questions like that. And in turn, what happens is you start developing a deeper relationship with others and God and the world. You develop character when you start thinking about the day of your death. It helps you focus on what really matters. You couldn't do that with the day of your birth. And really, he keeps pushing that, being superficial, being shallow in your relationships is foolish. It's not wise. It's unwise. I think about the many times that I've been officiating those funerals, or I've been at a funeral, and I remember crying at moments over the person that I miss so much. And then I remember, someone tells this crazy funny story, right, when we're all sitting there crying. And then we all start laughing, and it's almost like belly laugh. We get like an ab workout, we're laughing so hard because we're remembering this funny moment with them. You know what I'm talking about? It's like when you understand the depth of your sorrow, you really can appreciate the gift that is laughter, right, and humor. And that's where the teacher is going with this as we go throughout the chapter, that accepting the invitation to think about the day of your death actually propels you into pursuing wisdom in your life. So what happens much of the time is that we want to escape reality. We don't want to think about the day of our death, right? I mean, it's not something we usually want to talk about. And we say it's morbid to think about that, but this is not, the teacher's kind of flipping it on its head. He says, no, it's not morbid at all. In fact, when you start to do that, you put life in perspective. You start to understand what really matters and pursue wisdom, pursue the flourishing life. See, you don't want to experience life in its rawest form as a vapor, right? As a mist, as a blip, as he says, a havel. Like it's just a blip in the size of the universe. And you can just escape that. Like, I'm just going to pretend, right? I'm just going to act like it doesn't exist. And people do all sorts of things. And he actually walks through that in the rest of this text about how we try to do that. We don't want to think about all the hard times that are coming. We just want to pretend. He says that wisdom invites all of that stuff in, all the good stuff, all the bad stuff, to help us live a more meaningful life. So now the teacher starts to go into different aspects of how wisdom can play itself out, how we can be wise and unwise in particular areas of life. And if we hold these things in check, they can actually be meaningful, but there's a lot of times that we don't. So verse 7, he talks about money. He says that oppression drives the heart to madness, and that a bribe corrupts the heart. The word for oppression here in the original language is actually talking about extortion. That's what it means, the original word. It means extortion. So extortion, it's when you forcefully take or threaten someone to try to obtain something that's not yours. So that's what you're like. It's a very forceful act, right? It's threatening, it's forceful, it's extortion. That's the oppression that drives the heart to madness, which is obviously not good. You can be wise with money, right? We've talked about that, but you can easily start extorting others or taking bribes from others because of it. I mean, when you die, the teacher's thinking about, what are you going to do with all that extra cash on that day of your death? I mean, it's like, well, I can just give it to my family. Well, not always, right? Like, what are you going to do with that? What does it matter in the grand scheme of things? So again, he's talking about, look, money can lead you in the wrong direction of a flourishing life. And then he goes on and talks about patience in verse 8. He says, it's basically better to finish a project than to start one and never finish. That makes me really convicted, especially as someone who has ADHD, which is well known for doing that on a constant basis. But he says, look, if there's genuinely anything worthwhile in life for you, it's going to take a lot of patience to let it grow and develop. Now, if you remember last week's teaching, where we understood that we are in time and God is not, right? That God is outside the bounds of times. Think about the countless times in the Bible itself where it took a lot longer than people thought for God's promise to come to fruition, to come true for them. Abraham in Genesis, right? Told him he's going to have a son. He didn't have one. He didn't have his son that God promised till 25 years later after that moment. They spent 400 years in slavery, the Israelites, in Egypt before God delivered them from Egypt, as he had promised that he would. They were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years after they just got out of being in slavery, 400 years in Egypt. It's a long time, right? I mean, remember that God doesn't have a timetable like ours because he is outside of time. His timetable looks so much different than our timetable does because he's outside of time. So the teacher says, pursue patience. You don't have to have it now. It's not, you don't have to have it right now. And in fact, what you want now may not be the thing you really need. You see how this is harder in the time that we find ourselves in now, in this culture where everything seems to be at the tip of our fingers, right? That we can access things so quickly. The teacher says, no, patience is what you pursue. It takes things a long time to grow and develop that are worthwhile to pursue in life. That is wisdom. In verse 9, the teacher talks about anger. Now, I've talked about anger before in the last 2 or 3 years. But when you think about the day of your death, what if you went to the day of your death angry at somebody or many other people? Have you known people like that who are still angry until the day that they die? I have. And that really helps me put in perspective. I think about, in the grand scheme of things, does this really matter for me to hold on to a grudge this long or to be angry this long? I think about that in my current relationships, right? And that's what the teacher is trying to say. What happens when you never pursue reconciliation or never pursue forgiveness or never let go of the grudges that you have? The teacher says is foolish. Why? Because if you get frustrated up to the day of your death, it's like, what was the purpose? What happens when you die? What happens to all that? It's like you never did anything about it. In the grand scheme of things, it's not going to matter in the grand scheme of things compared to the beauty of relationships, right? And so he's going through this list. He's got money, he's got patience, he's got anger. And then the last thing he talks about, I'm going to spend a significant time on this because this is one that personally convicts me. So now the teacher goes into one final thing, and I want to spend a lot more time on this one because this is one I get convicted of, but I think is a lot more subtle, a lot more real to many of us listening today. And that is the word nostalgia. Have you heard the word nostalgia before? Nostalgia is that sentimental longing for the past. It's that moment where you hope to go back to moments that were more positive in your past than where you're at in the present. Listen to verse 10 of chapter 7, what the teacher says. He says this, "Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not wisdom that you ask this." Tell me if you've ever said anything like this. Things aren't like they used to be. Or, why is everything getting worse as we go on? Or, man, I'm really glad I didn't grow up in these times as a kid. Or, man, can't we just get back to the way my grandparents used to grow up, or grandparents did it, or my parents did it? Or, and I've heard this one in church, we need to get back to how the early church did it. Or really anything that says the phrase, we need to get back to fill in the blank. Do you know what I'm talking about? Have you said that recently? That nostalgia, that longing for something in the past that seemed better than what was happening in the present. That's why I want to spend some time with this, because this is a big one, friends. Because I know a lot of you said this. I've been in conversations even this week where this has been a topic of conversation. And I laugh because then I start reading this chapter and going, oh my goodness, now I got to talk about this guy. It's just so hard to talk about because we don't realize how prevalent it is. I remember even saying things like, I wish I could go back to the time where I was really on fire for God, like when I first was a Christian. Or, when I was younger, I wish I could jump as high as I used to, right? All these things are about nostalgia. I think if the teacher were around today and he would listen to us say these things, I would imagine him responding something like this, like he'd say something like, well, if you think things are really getting worse all the time, cheer up, because at least you'll be dead before it gets a lot worse, right? I can imagine him being snarky like that, say that maybe, I don't know. But I'd like to think that's what he says, just kind of reading the book so far up to this point. But let's step back a little bit here with this nostalgia. Because what we're saying when we talk about this, when we make these statements, is the past is better than the present. And some of you may think, yeah, of course, that's true. But here's where the teacher is trying to say this, because remember he said, this is not wise to think this way. It's not wise to think the thing that you think is good right now. Because if you think about it, if things are worse right now, does that mean you're saying that God is not in control? And some of you may think, no, of course not. Because what you think is, where I'm at right now means that, because things are worse, God doesn't love me anymore. He's forgotten all about me. You remember when in the 40 years in the wilderness, when Moses went in the mountain to receive the 10 Commandments, the Israelites cried out to God, like, I wish we went back to Egypt, right? Nostalgia. Even though it was slavery, right? I wish we were back in Egypt. And they even made a golden calf, an idol, right? It's the same story now. And the teacher says it's unwise, because when you think that the present is worse than the past, then you're really saying, God's forgotten about us. God's not really in control. How many times have we been blind to the good things that are right in front of us when we're in this mode? And yet, somehow, what's really interesting is that when we talk about the past, we forget about all the evil things that happened there as well. It's like we candy coat it. It's like we have revisionist history of our past, that we say it's better than it really was. Do you know what I'm talking about? I do this all the time when I tell stories. And that's why I said it's convicting to me, and that's why I'm spending time talking about it, because I know so many people can relate to this today. And because, most of the time you think about nostalgia, you think, well, this only applies to older people, right? The old people. They think about nostalgia because they have longer life to live. But no, this is for everybody. Every single person can relate to saying phrases like that. What is it about nostalgia that gets us all fired up? Because obviously a lot of us struggle with this. And we have this. And even the conversation I had this week, and many of them were all in this light. C.S. Lewis said this. He said that that nostalgia is the sweet emotion of longing, and it's always bittersweet. Let me give you an example. When I was younger, a younger parent, I took Grace out on daddy dates. I still go out on daddy dates here and there, not as often as I used to, probably should. But I go out to daddy dates, and one of our favorite places to go with my daughter Grace was IHOP, the International House of Pancakes. And it was like something that she looked forward to and I looked forward to, going on a daddy date. Like, can we go to IHOP for daddy date? Sure, we'll go. And, to Grace, this was like a 5-star restaurant. She thought it was the best thing in the world. I thought it was the best thing in the world because I was bonding with her. We had so many laughs and such great conversations and so many giggles. And I remember her getting the chocolate chip smiley face pancake all the time. And I thought whatever I got, omelets or pancakes or whatever, was just amazing. And drinking the coffee that now I think is horrible, whatever, but it was amazing. And I just have great memories of that. Well, I remember 2 or 3 years ago, we decided to take another daddy date, and she's like, let's go to IHOP. I'm like, great idea. It was pretty late at night, so we decided to go. It was I think it was almost midnight or something like that. We go to IHOP, and we're waiting and waiting and waiting. And we were waiting forever. It was they said a 10-minute wait ended up being 45 or 50 minutes, and the service was horrible, and the restaurant was dirty, and the food wasn't that great. And I remember Grace kind of I don't remember it being like this, and whatever. And by the time it was all said and done, she's like, why did I think this place was so great? Now, does that mean that our times at IHOP were in vain? Does that mean our times in IHOP were pointless? No. Those memories were incredible. IHOP was a great place to go when we were younger, but it's different now. It just isn't the same anymore. And that's not a bad thing. It just is what it is, right? I hate that phrase too, that cliche, but it really is different. What we thought it was like and how we imagined it and described it was not exactly the reality that it was when we got older. Now, not all IHOPs are that bad, but I'm sure you've had times like that, right? You go back to a place and you're like, huh. I even remember going back to my old house that I grew up in and going, this is a lot smaller than I thought it was. Or this was I thought this was great, because at the time it was. But when you come back to it later, it's much different. But yet we think the past is so much better than the present. C.S. Lewis says it like this in his book, The Weight of Glory. He says, the books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. For it was not in them, it only came through them. And what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. For they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a far country we have not yet visited. The feelings of nostalgia seem so right. It's a longing for a more beautiful person or a more beautiful place, right? A more beautiful time. And even our past experiences, we think that all of those things that we long for in the past are that we want. But in reality, what's really happening is that the past was never as good as how you describe it. It never was. and we get deceived by nostalgia. Lewis argues that what you're actually longing for is not the past, but you're longing for the future. That's what Lewis argues in the book. That you're longing for heaven fully restored, because those moments that you had, those moments I had with Grace at IHOP, were like little glimpses of heaven coming to earth. Just a little peek, and it just sparked something deep within us. Our hearts are longing for heaven. And we get that glimpse in that moment, but we think that moment is it. But it is pointing to something far in the future, heaven fully restored. That's what C.S. Lewis says that we're longing for, what nostalgia can do, but we point it in the wrong direction. Remember what we said last week? That God has made us his image bearers. Therefore, we're able to imagine what forever may be, what forever looks like. But because we're in time and God is outside of time, we don't know how to connect all those dots together. But yet, we still have a longing for eternity, for forever, for heaven in our own hearts. But nostalgia looks the opposite direction when you have those glimpses of a little bit of heaven. And that's very, very dangerous. It's unwise, it's foolish, the teacher says in Ecclesiastes chapter 7. The teacher says that wise people understand that God made us to look forward and long for him and for heaven in the future, and to not look backwards. Man, that is heavy stuff, isn't it? Because there's so many things I think about right now where we are knee deep in living a life of nostalgia and projecting that into thinking that is the way to the flourishing life. And the teacher of Ecclesiastes says, that's foolish. It's chasing the wind. All of these things that are mentioned in verses 7 to 10, right? Money and patience and anger and nostalgia. You look at the way that they're applied in the text. They are all forms of escapism, aren't they? If you think about it, like when it's misdirected and when it's unwise to live this way, they're all misdirected. They're all escapism. They're fleeing reality. Extortion and bribes with your money is escaping your responsibility, right? Impatience, and when you're not patient, it's wishing things were different from the way that they are and refusing to accept reality in the present. That's what you're doing. You're escaping reality in the present. Anger, if you think about it, is escaping your inability to cope with the present. Your inability to cope with the things that aren't going your way. That isn't the way that you want them to be. That's what happens with anger. And nostalgia's escapism is you're taking a vacation in the past instead of grappling with the present as it is, broken and all, and looking to the future. All of it is versions of escapism. So there's two threads that get pulled, right? You can live the life of escapism, and again, it's more subtle than we think it is. We'd like to think, well, I don't do that, but we do, don't we? Man, think about this last year. It's easy to long for the past, isn't it? How many times have we said things like, I wish it was like it was before the pandemic. I wish we could get back to normal. You ever heard that phrase before? You use that phrase? I've used that phrase. Can we just get back to normal? Or even saying the new normal, and people are like, I don't like that. I don't like the new normal. Why? Because we're locked in nostalgia. We're locked in the past, and what the past is better than the present. And it's simply not true. And when you say that, you are saying that God is not in control of the present, that you don't trust him in the present. That's what the teacher is saying. I think about other ways that people say this as well, right? I can't tell you how countless times in the last 2.5 years here that people say, I wish the church was like the way it was when we started here at New Ground. Yeah, I heard that a lot. I've heard, I wish every election cycle, I wish it was like it was when President so-and-so was in office. Or I mean, it doesn't matter who's it doesn't matter what party, whatever, everybody says it. Listen to the last two verses, though, of what we read today, because this is really fascinating what the teacher says. Listen to the last two verses that we read earlier today. He says, "Consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. In the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him." So even after talking about escapism and wisdom, and that we should pursue wisdom, he also says there is a limit to even pursuing wisdom here. Remember that we are inside time and that God is not. God is in control of the present right now, just like he was in the past, even if you think things are worse, even if things aren't going as well for you, even if you're suffering right now, God is still in control. He is outside of time. You can't understand how this all works. And if you just long for the past and think it was better, then you refuse to believe that God is in control of the present. It's a hard lesson to learn. And even though you can be wise and pursue wisdom and pursue the right things, recognize that even in these hard times that we're in, that God is just as much of control right now as he was in the past and will be in the future. And I actually find that hopeful and want to trust in that. And if you think about it, there's so many moments in good and bad where God has shaped us to become people that live flourishing lives for him. And all it takes is to stop pretending about what is happening right now and trying to escape it in all these different ways that the teacher says. And to recognize that God is right here in the present, in control, walking with you, and he knows what's best. And you might not understand how it all works. And that what we long for deep in our hearts is him in heaven. I mean, he's saying to us, look, the best is yet to come. So pay attention to right now in the midst of what's going on right in front of you. Don't try to escape in all these different ways. Even if you think it's wise, remember that God is in control right now. Will you pray with me? God, this is a hard lesson to learn, isn't it? Of all these ways that we try to escape. And God, I think about so many who have continued to do that. And God, we admit these times have been so difficult. And I think about all the division that's happened in this country. I think about all the division that's happened in our churches, God, of how we have focused so much on nostalgia, on going back to when it was great, and not thinking that what we're in now is shaping us for the future. Not what we're experiencing right now is this longing for the full restoration of heaven to come to earth. And God, I pray as for those of us who are followers of Jesus that we continue to have the perspective and live our lives accordingly. God, I pray for those today who are listening, who are still checking this out, this faith thing out, and listening to these teachings. And God, recognizing that it is through Christ that we have freedom, true freedom. For his shed blood on the cross and for his resurrection from the dead to conquer all that's broken in the world, to conquer death. God, to be invited into that. Oh, man, it seems so counterintuitive, God. But it is the way of the flourishing life. And God, I pray that maybe today that as people are listening and for the first time they're sensing something deep in their hearts, this longing that we've been talking about, longing for something better, that the best is yet to come. God, you have provided for that in Jesus Christ. And I pray in this moment, God, that maybe even just acknowledging in their hearts something like this, God, I just want to make you the center of my life. I recognize that I can't be in control of everything. And so I want you to take control of my life. I know that you're in control, but I want you to control my life and make me the kind of person that you want me to be, to live the best kind of life, to live the flourishing life. God, I pray that this week we would walk in faith that we are living a life where we believe that you are in control even when things are hard. God, that we would forego arguments that steep themselves in nostalgia and look forward to the future, God, to recognize the things in our present that are shaping us to be the kinds of people that you want us to be in the future. I pray that we may take that to heart and take that together. In the name of Jesus, I pray these things, and everybody said, amen.